The conference room buzzed with the low murmur of military personnel settling into their seats. Outside the windows of the Pentagon briefing room, the Washington skyline stretched beneath a gray November sky. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her dress blues and took a seat in the third row, her eyes scanning the faces around her. The room was filled with officers from every branch of the military, all summoned for what the invitation had cryptically described as a special operations consultation. At exactly 1400 hours, the side door opened and Captain Marcus Rodriguez entered. His seal trident gleamed against his naval uniform, and the room instinctively quieted. Rodriguez was a legend in special operations circles, though few in the room had ever worked directly with him. His reputation preceded him like a shadow. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and more classified missions than most officers would see in their entire careers. Rodriguez moved to the front of the room with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years moving silently through hostile territory. His dark eyes swept across the assembled officers, taking inventory of ranks, specialties, and faces. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had led men through impossible situations and brought them home alive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time today. What I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the highest levels. Nothing discussed in this room leaves this room. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have a situation developing in the Horn of Africa. Intelligence suggests a high-value target has been located in a compound approximately 40 kilometers from the Eritrean border. The target has been eluding capture for 18 months. Sarah listened intently, her mind automatically cataloging the tactical implications. She had studied the region extensively during her time at the Naval War College. The terrain was unforgiving, the political situation unstable, and any military action would need to be swift and precise. Rodriguez continued, his presentation methodical and thorough. He outlined the intelligence gathered, the strategic importance of the target, and the narrow window of opportunity they had to act. As he spoke, Sarah noticed how he commanded the room without raising his voice or resorting to dramatic gestures. This was a man who had earned respect through action, not words. The compound is situated on a plateau accessible by only 2 roads. Both are heavily monitored. Traditional insertion methods present unacceptable risks to both the mission and personnel. Rodriguez clicked to the next slide, showing aerial reconnaissance photos. The compound looked like a fortress carved into the rocky landscape. Sarah studied the images carefully. She could see the defensive positions, the clear fields of fire, and the natural barriers that made ground assault nearly impossible. Her pilot's mind began automatically calculating approach vectors, considering the challenges of the terrain and the limited options for air support. "This brings me to why you're all here," Rodriguez said, his gaze moving across the room. "This mission requires a level of precision and expertise that pushes the boundaries of what we normally ask of our people. We need individuals who don't just meet the minimum requirements but who excel in extreme conditions." The room was completely silent now. Every officer present understood they were being evaluated, though for what exactly remained unclear. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before any significant mission briefing. It was anticipation mixed with the weight of responsibility. Rodriguez walked closer to the seated officers, his eyes still scanning faces. "The insertion will require flying through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, at night under radio silence, with zero margin for error. The pilot will need to navigate mountain passes in complete darkness, avoid radar detection, and deliver a team to a landing zone no larger than a basketball court." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had flown missions like this before, though never in quite such extreme conditions. Her experience in Afghanistan had taught her to read terrain like a map, to feel the wind patterns through the aircraft's controls, and to trust her instincts when instruments weren't enough. The weather window is narrow. We have intelligence suggesting a storm front will move through the region in 72 hours, which gives us a brief opportunity when cloud cover will mask our approach but won't prevent flying. Rodriguez paused again, his expression growing more serious. "This isn't a training exercise. This isn't a simulation. This is a real-world mission, with real consequences for failure." The captain's words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from the other officers in the room. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward with interest. She remained perfectly still, her training keeping her expression neutral while her mind raced through the possibilities. Rodriguez reached the front of the room again and turned to face them directly. His next words would change everything for someone in that room, though at that moment none of them knew who. "So let me ask you this," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Any combat pilots here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an arena. Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense as the words registered. Around her, she could sense other officers shifting, some raising their hands, others straightening in their chairs. But something made her hesitate. Combat pilot. The phrase carried weight that civilians could never understand. It wasn't just about flying aircraft or completing missions. It was about making split-second decisions while people shot at you. About bringing crews home when everything went wrong. About pushing machines and human endurance beyond their limits because failure meant death. 3 hands went up immediately. Colonel James Patterson from the Air Force, a veteran of Operation Desert Storm with over 2,000 flight hours in hostile airspace. Major Lisa Chen from the Marines, who had flown support missions during the invasion of Iraq and earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions under fire. Captain Robert Hayes from the Army, a helicopter pilot who had completed 4 tours in Afghanistan and survived 2 crash landings. Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement to each raised hand, his expression giving nothing away. Sarah could see him cataloging information, weighing qualifications against mission requirements. She knew her own credentials matched or exceeded those of the officers who had already identified themselves. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way Rodriguez had phrased the question. Not just pilots, but combat pilots. The distinction mattered. Anyone could fly an aircraft in peacetime, but combat flying required a different kind of person entirely. It demanded the ability to function when adrenaline flooded your system, when radio chatter filled your headphones with urgent voices, when tracers lit up the night sky around your aircraft. Sarah's mind drifted back to a night over Kandahar 3 years earlier. She had been flying a medical evacuation mission when her helicopter came under fire from insurgents positioned in the mountains. The crew chief had been hit, her co-pilot was struggling with damaged controls, and she had wounded soldiers in the back who would die if she didn't get them to medical care within minutes. She remembered the sound of bullets striking the aircraft's armor, the way the helicopter had shuddered with each impact. Most of all, she remembered the absolute clarity that had settled over her in that moment. All the noise and chaos had faded into background, leaving only the essential task at hand: fly the aircraft, save the crew, complete the mission. That night had changed her understanding of what it meant to be a combat pilot. It wasn't about the training or the qualifications or the medals. It was about the person you became when everything went wrong and lives depended on your decisions. Rodriguez was asking for more details from the volunteers. "Colonel Patterson, what's your experience with night operations in mountainous terrain?" The Air Force officer responded with a detailed summary of missions flown over the Balkans and Afghanistan. His record was impressive, his experience undeniable. "Major Chen, have you flown insertion missions for Special Operations Forces?" The Marine pilot outlined several missions supporting force reconnaissance teams, describing the precision required to deliver small teams to hostile landing zones without detection. Sarah listened to each response, comparing their experiences to her own. She had flown night missions in mountains that would challenge any pilot. She had inserted special operations teams into zones so dangerous that other pilots had refused the missions. She had more combat flight hours than anyone else in the room, though few people knew it because much of her service record was classified. But still, she remained silent. Rodriguez moved on to Captain Hayes, asking about his helicopter experience in confined landing zones. The Army pilot described several successful missions in Afghanistan, including one where he had landed on a mountain peak barely large enough for his aircraft to retrieve wounded soldiers. As the questioning continued, Sarah noticed something in Rodriguez's demeanor. He was thorough and professional with each pilot, but she sensed he wasn't hearing what he needed to hear. There was a quality to this mission that required more than just technical skill and combat experience. It demanded something indefinable, something that couldn't be measured in flight hours or decorations. The briefing room felt smaller now, the air thick with tension and unspoken competition. Every pilot present understood that only one would be selected for whatever mission Rodriguez had in mind. The stakes were clearly higher than a routine operation, and the margin for error was apparently non-existent. Rodriguez completed his questioning of the volunteer pilots and paused, his gaze moving across the room once more. Sarah could feel his eyes pass over her, linger for a moment, then continue on. Did he know something about her background that the others didn't? Had he already reviewed their service records before the briefing? "Thank you all for volunteering," Rodriguez said finally. "I want to be clear about what this mission entails. The pilot selected will be flying alone at night through terrain that has claimed aircraft before. There will be no backup, no second chances, and no rescue mission if things go wrong. The insertion must be precise to the meter, and the extraction window will be no more than 30 minutes. The room absorbed this information in stunned silence. Even the most experienced combat pilots rarely flew solo missions into hostile territory. The risks were exponential when you didn't have a co-pilot or crew to assist with navigation, threat detection, and emergency procedures. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just a difficult mission. This was the kind of operation that defined a pilot's entire career, assuming they survived it. It was the sort of mission that separated the exceptional from the merely competent. Rodriguez's voice cut through her thoughts. "Let me ask again because I want to be absolutely certain. Any combat pilots here who have experience with solo night operations in denied territory?" This time the silence stretched longer. Colonel Patterson kept his hand raised, but Sarah could see uncertainty in his expression. Major Chen lowered her hand slightly, clearly reconsidering her qualification for such an extreme mission. Captain Hayes maintained his position, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was fighting internal doubts. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She knew what Rodriguez was really asking. He wasn't looking for someone who met the minimum qualifications. He was looking for someone who thrived in impossible situations, someone who could do what others couldn't or wouldn't do. Slowly, with deliberate precision, Sarah Mitchell rose to her feet. Every head in the room turned toward Sarah as she stood. The silence that followed was different from before. It carried a weight that made the air feel thicker, more charged. Rodriguez's eyes locked onto hers immediately, and she saw something flicker across his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe surprise that she had waited so long to identify herself. "Captain Mitchell," Rodriguez said, and the fact that he knew her name without introduction sent a ripple of awareness through the room. "Thank you for standing." Sarah remained at attention, her hands at her sides, her expression carefully neutral. She could feel the eyes of every officer in the room studying her, measuring her against their own assumptions about what a combat pilot should look like. At 5 feet 6 inches with an unremarkable build, she didn't fit the stereotype that many people carried in their minds. "Captain, would you mind sharing your qualifications with the group?" Sarah's voice was steady when she spoke, carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Sir, I have 1,800 hours of combat flight time over Afghanistan and Iraq. 700 of those hours were solo night operations in denied territory. I've completed 43 special operations insertions and extractions, including 12 missions that were classified as high risk, no backup scenarios." The numbers landed in the room like physical objects. Several officers turned to look at each other, clearly surprised by the scope of her experience. Colonel Patterson's expression showed grudging respect, mixed with curiosity about how someone of her relatively junior rank had accumulated such extensive combat time. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Captain, can you be more specific about your solo night operations experience?" "Sir, I've flown reconnaissance missions deep into Taliban-controlled territory, often spending 8 to 10 hours alone in hostile airspace. Navigation was done using terrain recognition and dead reckoning when electronic systems were compromised or needed to remain silent. I've landed in zones as small as 50 meters square in complete darkness, with enemy forces known to be within small arms range." Major Chen leaned forward slightly. Her professional interest clearly piqued. Solo flights of that duration required not just technical skill, but extraordinary mental endurance. Flying alone for 10 hours while under constant threat would push most pilots beyond their breaking point. "Tell me about your most challenging solo mission," Rodriguez said, his tone suggesting this was more than casual conversation. Sarah paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Much of her service record was classified, but she could discuss certain missions in general terms. "Sir, approximately 2 years ago I was tasked with delivering critical intelligence to a forward operating base that had been cut off by enemy action. The flight required navigating through 3 separate mountain passes in zero visibility conditions. With all electronic navigation systems offline to avoid detection, she continued, her voice maintaining the same steady cadence. The weather deteriorated during the flight, creating whiteout conditions. I had to rely entirely on terrain recognition and instrument flying, while avoiding peaks that rose to over 12,000 feet. The mission duration was 9 hours and 20 minutes, including a 2-hour hold in a valley while enemy patrols passed through the area. The room was completely silent now. Even Rodriguez seemed impressed by the scope of what she was describing. Flying through mountain passes in whiteout conditions was challenging enough, with a full crew and modern navigation equipment. Doing it alone at night, while avoiding enemy forces, bordered on the impossible. Captain Hayes spoke up from his seat. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what aircraft were you flying?" "Modified Black Hawk, Captain. Stripped down for extended range and reduced radar signature. No co-pilot. Minimal instrumentation to reduce electronic emissions." Rodriguez studied her face carefully. "Captain Mitchell, what makes you confident you could handle the type of mission I've outlined today?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Sir, I've learned that successful solo operations in denied territory require more than just flying skills. They require the ability to make decisions quickly with incomplete information, to adapt when plans change, and to maintain focus during extended periods of stress. Most importantly, they require accepting that failure is not an option because there's no one else to rely on." She paused, then continued with quiet conviction. "I've flown missions where the margin for error was measured in meters and seconds. I've had to land aircraft with damaged systems while under fire. I've spent hours alone in hostile territory with only my training and judgment to rely on. If this mission requires those qualities, then I believe I'm qualified to attempt it." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with someone near the back of the room whom Sarah hadn't noticed before. The man was in civilian clothes, but his bearing suggested military or intelligence background. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Captain Mitchell, your service record has been reviewed prior to this briefing," Rodriguez said, confirming Sarah's suspicion that this wasn't a random selection process. "Your commanding officers describe you as someone who volunteers for missions that other pilots decline. They also note that you've never failed to complete a mission, regardless of the obstacles encountered." Sarah felt a flush of pride at the recognition, but kept her expression neutral. "Sir, I've been fortunate to serve with excellent crews and have good support from ground personnel." "Don't sell yourself short, Captain," Rodriguez said with something approaching a smile. "The missions I'm referring to were solo operations. There were no crews to rely on." The weight of the conversation was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't a general call for volunteers. Rodriguez had been looking for someone specific, someone with a very particular set of qualifications and experience. Sarah was beginning to understand that her presence at this briefing might not have been as random as she had initially assumed. Rodriguez turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your time and your willingness to volunteer. I'm going to ask Captain Mitchell to remain for additional discussion. The rest of you are dismissed. And I remind you that everything discussed here today remains classified." As the other officers filed out of the room, Sarah noticed the mixture of expressions on their faces. Some showed disappointment at not being selected. Others seemed relieved to avoid what was clearly going to be an extremely dangerous mission. Colonel Patterson paused near her seat and leaned in slightly. "Good luck, Captain," he said quietly. "Whatever they're planning, it sounds like they need the best pilot they can find." Sarah nodded her thanks as he moved toward the exit. Within minutes, the room had emptied except for herself, Rodriguez, and the civilian who had been observing from the back. As the door closed behind the last departing officer, Sarah realized that the real briefing was just beginning. The civilian approached from the back of the room as the door sealed with a soft click. Sarah remained standing, her military bearing intact despite the growing realization that nothing about this briefing had been what it appeared. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. "Captain Mitchell, I'm David Hartwell, Deputy Director of Operations for the agency," he said, extending his hand. The handshake was firm, professional, and told Sarah everything she needed to know about how classified this mission actually was. CIA involvement meant this operation existed in the shadows between military action and covert intelligence work. Rodriguez gestured toward the front row of chairs. "Captain, please have a seat. What we're about to discuss doesn't leave this room, and if you decide not to participate, you'll be transferred to a desk job for the remainder of your service. That's not a threat. It's simply operational security." Sarah settled into the indicated chair, her mind racing through the implications. Desk job assignments after exposure to highly classified material were standard protocol, but they effectively ended operational careers. By sitting down, she was committing to see this through to whatever conclusion awaited. Hartwell activated a secure tablet and brought up a new set of images. These weren't the reconnaissance photos Rodriguez had shown earlier. These were close-up surveillance photographs of individuals, technical diagrams of what appeared to be weapon systems, and facility layouts that looked far more complex than a simple compound. "Captain, what Captain Rodriguez showed the group earlier was cover material. Accurate in its basic details, but incomplete." Hartwell's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to briefing operations where lives hung in the balance. "The target isn't a terrorist leader. It's a facility where advanced weapons technology is being developed by actors who shouldn't have access to such capabilities." The first image showed a man in his 60s wearing a lab coat, standing beside equipment that Sarah didn't recognize but which radiated an aura of sophisticated technology. Dr. Vladimir Petrov, former Soviet weapons designer. He disappeared from Russian custody 18 months ago, along with several terabytes of classified research data. Rodriguez took over the briefing. "Intelligence suggests Petrov has been working to complete a project he began during the Cold War. We believe he's close to finalizing a weapon system that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in several regions." Sarah studied the photographs carefully. The facility looked more like a research laboratory than a terrorist compound. "Sir, what kind of weapon system are we discussing?" Hartwell exchanged a glance with Rodriguez before answering. "Electromagnetic pulse technology, but miniaturized and deployable. Think of an EMP device that could be delivered by a single person and disable all electronic systems within a 50-mile radius. Communications, transportation, power grids, medical equipment, everything." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. A weapon like that could cripple entire cities, shut down airports, disable hospital equipment keeping patients alive, render military forces helpless. In the wrong hands, it could cause casualties in the millions without firing a single conventional shot. The facility is located in a region where traditional military intervention would trigger international incidents we can't afford, Rodriguez continued.
"The local government is hostile to American interests, and any conventional assault would be seen as an act of war." Sarah began to understand the impossible parameters of this mission.
"You need someone who can get in and out without leaving evidence of American involvement." "Exactly," Hartwell confirmed. "The insertion must appear to be the work of local forces or criminal elements. No American equipment, no communications with U.S. forces, no backup support. If something goes wrong, we cannot acknowledge the mission existed." Rodriguez pulled up tactical diagrams of the facility. The compound is built into a mountainside, accessible only by a single road that's heavily monitored. However, there's a plateau approximately 2 kilometers away that could serve as a landing zone. The approach would require flying through a canyon system that radar cannot penetrate, but it's extremely narrow and dangerous. Sarah studied the topographical information. The canyon was barely wide enough for a helicopter, with walls rising several hundred feet on both sides. Flying through it at night would require incredible precision and nerves of steel. One mistake would mean certain death, and there would be no way to rescue survivors. "What about the team I'd be inserting?" she asked. 3 specialists, Rodriguez answered. "Demolitions expert, electronics warfare specialist, and myself. We go in, secure the research data, destroy the facility and any prototypes, and extract within 30 minutes. Hartwell added. "The window of opportunity is extremely narrow. Intelligence indicates that Petrov is planning to move his operation within the week. If we don't act now, we may never get another chance to prevent this technology from proliferating." Sarah absorbed the information, her pilot's mind automatically calculating risks and challenges. The flight itself would be at the extreme edge of what was possible, even for someone with her experience. The weather, terrain, and timing all had to align perfectly. There would be no margin for error and no second chances. What aircraft would I be flying? Rodriguez smiled for the first time since she'd met him. That's the one piece of good news. We've acquired a modified helicopter that officially doesn't exist. Stealth technology, advanced navigation systems, and performance capabilities that exceed anything in the standard inventory. The problem is it's so advanced that only a handful of pilots have the skill to fly it safely. Hartwell activated another screen showing technical specifications that made Sarah's eyes widen. The aircraft represented a leap forward in helicopter design, incorporating technologies she'd only heard rumors about. It was faster, quieter, and more maneuverable than anything she'd ever flown. The bad news, Rodriguez continued, is that you'd have exactly 6 hours of training time before the mission. The aircraft is too sensitive to risk extended training flights, and our window of opportunity won't allow for delays. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 6 hours to master an aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, then use it to fly the most dangerous mission of her career. The challenge was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Captain," Hartwell said, his tone becoming more serious, "I want to be completely clear about what we're asking. This mission has approximately a 60% chance of success under optimal conditions. The risks to your life are substantial, and if you're captured, the United States government will deny any knowledge of your existence." Sarah looked at both men, understanding finally why they had specifically sought her out. They needed someone with her exact combination of skills, experience, and psychological makeup. Someone who could handle extreme risk, make split-second decisions under pressure, and complete impossible missions when failure meant global consequences. She thought about Dr. Petrov's weapon system, about what it could do in the hands of terrorists or hostile governments. She thought about the millions of people who would be at risk if this technology spread. Then she thought about the canyon walls that would try to kill her, the aircraft she'd have to master in hours instead of months, and the 3 men whose lives would depend on her ability to fly them safely into hell and back out again. "When do we start?" she asked. The secure hangar at the Nevada test facility was larger than anything Sarah had ever seen, its ceiling disappearing into shadows despite powerful lighting systems. Armed guards had escorted her through 3 separate security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last. Her phone, watch, and all personal electronics had been confiscated and stored in what looked like a bank vault. The aircraft sitting in the center of the hangar took her breath away. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, all sleek angles and materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The helicopter was smaller than she had expected, clearly designed for speed and stealth rather than cargo capacity. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Rodriguez approached from behind, having appeared as silently as his SEAL training had taught him. "The engineers call her the Ghost. She's been in development for 8 years, cost more than most countries' annual defense budgets." Sarah walked slowly around the aircraft, her trained eye cataloging details. The rotor system was unlike anything she'd seen, with blades that seemed impossibly thin yet strong. The engine compartments were sealed and angled to reduce heat signatures. Most striking were the surfaces themselves, which seemed to shift color slightly as viewing angles changed. "Stealth coating," explained the chief engineer, a woman in her 40s who introduced herself simply as Dr. Chen. "Radar-absorbing materials combined with adaptive camouflage technology. From more than 500 meters away, she's essentially invisible to both electronic detection and human observation." Rodriguez handed Sarah a tablet containing technical specifications. "Your training window starts now. 6 hours to learn everything you need to know about flying the most advanced helicopter ever built." Sarah began reading immediately, her mind absorbing the technical details with practiced efficiency. The control systems were entirely fly-by-wire, meaning the aircraft's computers interpreted pilot inputs and translated them into rotor adjustments. It was simultaneously more responsive and more complex than traditional helicopters. The navigation system uses a combination of GPS, inertial guidance, and terrain mapping, Dr. Chen explained as they moved to the cockpit. In stealth mode, it can fly pre-programmed routes automatically, but for the kind of precision you'll need, manual control is essential. Sarah settled into the pilot's seat, her hands finding the controls instinctively. The cockpit was a mix of familiar and revolutionary, with traditional flight instruments supplemented by holographic displays that seemed to float in mid-air. The control response was immediate and precise, requiring much lighter touch than she was accustomed to. "The power-to-weight ratio is almost double that of standard helicopters," Rodriguez said from the co-pilot seat. "She'll accelerate faster than you expect and climb like a rocket." The danger is over-controlling. The computer systems compensate for pilot error up to a point, but if you exceed their parameters, they'll shut down and leave you flying manually. The first hour was spent learning basic flight characteristics in a sophisticated simulator that perfectly replicated the aircraft's responses. Sarah found herself having to unlearn some habits developed over years of flying conventional helicopters. The Ghost required finesse rather than force, precision rather than power. Your flight path will take you through terrain that challenges the aircraft's limits, Dr. Chen said, bringing up a three-dimensional map of the target area. The canyon walls are separated by an average of 40 meters, with the narrowest point being 32 meters. Your rotor disc is 28 meters, leaving you 2 meters of clearance on each side. Sarah studied the topographical data, her stomach tightening as she realized the true scope of what she was being asked to do. Flying through a canyon with 2 meters of clearance required more than skill. It required perfection sustained over several miles of the most challenging terrain on Earth. What about wind effects? She asked, her pilot's training focusing on the variables that could kill her. That's the biggest unknown, Rodriguez admitted. The canyon creates its own weather patterns. Wind shear, updrafts, and crosswinds that can change without warning. The Ghost's computer systems can compensate for gradual changes, but sudden gusts could be problematic. Hour 2 was spent in advanced flight simulations, practicing approaches to landing zones that seemed impossibly small. The Ghost's precision was remarkable, but Sarah was learning that precision required constant attention to subtle changes in control inputs. There was no autopilot for the kind of flying this mission demanded. The stealth systems have limitations, Dr. Chen warned during a brief break. Active stealth mode reduces engine power by approximately 15% and limits your maximum climb rate. If you need full performance, you'll have to choose between stealth and survival. Sarah nodded, filing away another critical detail. Military aviation was always about trade-offs between competing requirements. Speed versus stealth, range versus payload, safety versus mission success. This operation seemed designed to test every compromise pilots were trained to make. Hour 3 introduced night vision systems that made darkness almost irrelevant. The Ghost sensors could detect heat signatures, trace amounts of electromagnetic emissions, and even distinguish between different types of vegetation. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the amount of information available, learning to filter essential data from interesting but irrelevant details. Information overload is the biggest challenge for pilots transitioning to this aircraft, Dr. Chen observed. The temptation is to watch the displays instead of flying the helicopter. Trust your instincts and use the technology to enhance your situational awareness, not replace it. Rodriguez spent hour 4 drilling Sarah on emergency procedures. The Ghost's advanced systems created new types of potential failures, from computer malfunctions to stealth system overloads. Each emergency scenario required different responses, and there would be no time to consult manuals during the actual mission. If the navigation computers fail while you're in the canyon, you'll have to fly it manually with no electronic assistance, he said bluntly. At night, in a space barely wider than your rotor disc, using only night vision and instincts. Are you prepared for that possibility? Sarah considered the question seriously. Flying the canyon manually would require spatial awareness and reflexes at the very edge of human capability. It would mean trusting her training and experience completely while operating an unfamiliar aircraft in impossible conditions. I've flown through mountain passes and whiteout conditions with failed instruments, she answered. This would be more challenging, but the principles are similar. Maintain constant situational awareness. Make small corrections rather than large ones and never panic. Hour 5 was dedicated to mission-specific scenarios. Sarah practiced the exact approach route she would fly in less than 24 hours, memorizing landmarks and timing that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The simulation was so realistic that she found herself genuinely nervous despite knowing it was just training. The extraction will be the most dangerous part, Rodriguez warned. We'll have 30 minutes on the ground maximum. During that time, you'll need to maintain the aircraft in full readiness while remaining hidden from facility security. If they discover your location, you'll have seconds to get airborne before they bring heavy weapons to bear. As Hour 6 concluded, Sarah felt both confident in her ability to fly the Ghost and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The aircraft was magnificent, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental risks of the mission. Success would depend on her ability to execute flawlessly, while dealing with variables that could change without warning. Dr. Chen approached as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit for the final time. "Captain, I've never seen anyone adapt to this aircraft so quickly. Your instincts for helicopter flight are exceptional." Rodriguez nodded agreement. "Captain Mitchell, are you ready for this mission?" Sarah looked at the Ghost one more time, its sleek form representing both incredible capability and enormous risk. In less than 12 hours, she would climb into that cockpit and attempt something that pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible. 3 lives would depend on her skill, and the security of millions might depend on their success. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The Ghost lifted off from the desert base at exactly 23:47 hours, disappearing into the moonless night like a shadow-given flight. Sarah felt the aircraft respond to her touch with the precise sensitivity she had practiced during training. But nothing could truly prepare a pilot for the reality of flying an experimental aircraft into hostile territory. Rodriguez sat behind her with 2 other specialists she had met only hours before. Miller, the demolitions expert, was a compact man who spoke in technical specifications and handled explosives with the casual familiarity others reserved for tools. Washington, the electronics warfare specialist, carried equipment that could disrupt communications and disable security systems across several square miles. "First checkpoint in 12 minutes, Rodriguez said through the intercom, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. So far, so good. The flight to the target area would take 3 hours, following a route carefully planned to avoid radar installations and populated areas. For the first 2 hours, Sarah flew at medium altitude over terrain that posed no unusual challenges, using the time to become completely comfortable with the Ghost's flight characteristics. The aircraft was everything the engineers had promised: silent, responsive, and nearly invisible to detection systems. Sarah found herself marveling at the smoothness of the ride and the precision of the controls, even while her mind remained focused on the challenges ahead. Approaching the border region, Rodriguez announced as they crossed into airspace where American aircraft officially had no business flying. "Entering stealth mode." Sarah felt the subtle change as the Ghost's stealth systems activated. Engine power decreased slightly and new displays appeared showing electromagnetic signatures from ground-based radar systems. They were flying through one of the most heavily monitored regions on Earth, yet their presence registered nowhere on enemy screens. 1 hour to target, Rodriguez said, beginning descent to terrain following altitude. The next phase of the flight required Sarah to bring the Ghost down to less than 50 feet above ground level, using the aircraft's terrain mapping system to follow the contours of increasingly rugged landscape. At this altitude, they were invisible to radar but vulnerable to ground-based observation if anyone happened to be looking up. Sarah's concentration intensified as the terrain became more challenging. Rocky outcroppings and sudden elevation changes required constant attention to avoid obstacles, while maintaining the low altitude essential for avoiding detection. The Ghost systems provided warning of upcoming terrain features, but flying this close to the ground left no margin for error. 30 minutes to canyon entrance, Rodriguez reported. Weather is holding, but we're seeing some wind activity from the thermal effects of the surrounding mountains. Sarah could feel the wind beginning to affect the aircraft, subtle shifts in air pressure that required constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. The Ghost's computers compensated for most turbulence, but she could sense the limits of their capability approaching as conditions deteriorated. The canyon appeared in her displays as a dark slash cutting through the mountainside. From above, it looked impossibly narrow, a geological accident that seemed designed to kill unwary aviators. Sarah took a deep breath and began her descent toward the entrance, knowing that the next 20 minutes would determine whether they lived or died. "Entering the canyon," she announced, her voice professionally calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The walls rose around them like ancient guardians, their rocky surfaces passing just meters from the Ghost's rotor tips. Sarah's world narrowed to the space immediately around the aircraft, her attention focused entirely on maintaining precise control while following the canyon's twisting path. The first mile was manageable, with relatively straight sections that allowed her to establish a rhythm. The Ghost responded beautifully to her inputs, its precision systems translating her intentions into exact movements. Sarah began to feel a cautious optimism that they might actually survive this approach. The optimism vanished as they entered a section where the canyon walls closed to their minimum separation. 2 meters of clearance on each side meant that any significant control error would result in rotor strike and instant destruction. Sarah's hands moved with microscopic precision, making tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft centered in the narrow passage. "Jesus," Miller whispered from the back, apparently forgetting that the intercom was active. "Quiet," Rodriguez commanded, understanding that Sarah needed to concentrate completely on flying. Any distraction could be fatal in these conditions. Wind shear hit them without warning as they rounded a sharp curve in the canyon. The Ghost lurched sideways and Sarah felt her heart stop as the aircraft drifted toward the right wall. Her training took over, making control inputs by instinct rather than conscious thought, and the helicopter stabilized with less than a meter to spare. "Nice save," Rodriguez said quietly, his tone carrying genuine admiration for Sarah's skill. The canyon began to widen slightly as they approached the exit, and Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually survive the approach. The facility's plateau appeared in her displays, a relatively flat area that looked enormous after the claustrophobic confines of the canyon. "Target in sight," she announced, beginning the approach to their landing zone. 2 minutes to touchdown. The plateau was exactly as briefed, a relatively level area surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would conceal the Ghost from casual observation. Sarah brought the aircraft down with textbook precision, the landing gear touching the ground so gently that the impact was barely perceptible. "Outstanding flying." "Captain," Rodriguez said as the engines spooled down to idle. "Now comes the hard part." Sarah watched through night vision as the 3 specialists disappeared into the darkness, their equipment and weapons making them look like figures from a futuristic warfare scenario. Her role now was to wait, maintain the aircraft in readiness for immediate departure, and monitor communications for any sign that the mission had been compromised. 23 minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah performed system checks, monitored weather conditions, and tried not to think about what Rodriguez and his team were doing inside the facility. The Ghost sat silent and ready, its engines warm and all systems prepared for emergency departure. "Ghost, this is Hammer." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the encrypted radio. "Package is secure, facility is neutralized. Requesting immediate extraction." Sarah brought the engines to full power as 3 figures emerged from the darkness, moving with the urgent purpose of people who needed to be somewhere else very quickly. They reached the aircraft as the rotors achieved full rotation, throwing themselves into the passenger compartment without ceremony. "Go, go, go," Rodriguez shouted as soon as the last man was aboard. Sarah lifted off immediately, climbing as steeply as the Ghost's performance would allow. Behind them, explosions lit up the night sky as the facility and its contents were destroyed beyond recovery. Dr. Petrov's weapon system would never threaten anyone again. The return flight through the canyon required all of Sarah's skill and concentration, but seemed almost routine after the stress of the approach. They had accomplished something that military planners had considered barely possible, and all 4 of them were returning home alive. "Outstanding work, all of you," Rodriguez said as they cleared the canyon and began climbing to cruising altitude. "Captain Mitchell, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with exhaustion as the adrenaline began to fade. She had flown the mission of her career, pushed both herself and an experimental aircraft to their absolute limits, and succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. "Thank you, sir," she replied, already thinking about the long flight home. It was an honor to serve. 3 hours later, the Ghost touched down at the Nevada facility where the mission had begun. As Sarah shut down the engines and the rotors wound down to silence, she realized that everything in her career had led to this moment. She had proven that when the impossible was required, when lives and global security hung in the balance, there were still people willing to risk everything to do what was right. Rodriguez appeared at her window as she completed the post-flight checklist. "Captain, there's a promotion board meeting next week. I understand they're looking for candidates for Major. Interested?" Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "Sir, I thought you'd never ask."